And now, I'd like to introduce the panelists for this session. Terry Holliday is the Kentucky Commissioner of Education and President of the Council of Chief State School Officers. June Atkinson is the North Carolina State Superintendent of Education and serves as Vice President of the Council of Chief State School Officers. And Lizette Reynolds is the Chief Deputy Commissioner of Education in Texas, and she is taking the place of Commissioner Michael Williams, who unfortunately could not be with us today. Here to moderate the session is Michael Petrilli, Vice President of National Programs and Policy with the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. Mr. Petrilli, I turn it over to you. Please welcome our panelists.
Great. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Governor. Boy, that reminds me of when I used to have hair. That was before the Common Core debate got going in this country. It is so nice to see all of you. I've seen many of you over the last year in hearings and all over in state capitals across this country. We are here today to talk about state standards. Yes, the Common Core, but state standards more broadly. We are, of course, we have Lizette here to represent Texas, which, as you may know, did not join the Common Core effort. In fact, there's a recent Attorney General opinion in Texas that makes teaching the Common Core illegal in Texas. So we will talk about that. There's so much ground to cover. We all know this has become the big issue in education today, the big controversial issue. We will talk some about the politics, but want to focus mostly on implementation issues, how it's going out there, and what we can do as policymakers, as policy advocates, to support the changes that teachers are working on in the classroom every day. So with that, we're going to hop right in. And why don't we go ahead and start with Dr. Atkinson, or June, if I can call you June. So North Carolina, I believe, is the only state whose legislature is still in session right now, as it's closing out the spring session. And there's a debate going on in North Carolina about pulling out of the Common Core. So would be curious from your perspective, what is this debate about in North Carolina? What are the reasons that people are citing for wanting to pull the North Carolina out of the Common Core? And as somebody who supports these new standards, how do you respond to their arguments and try to make the case for these higher standards?
In 2008, our State Board of Education appointed a committee to look at North Carolina standards. And that committee recommended that we revise all of our standards. North Carolina is a state that has had standards since the beginning of public education in our state. 175 years ago in 2015, we will celebrate our 175 years. Since the inception of public education in North Carolina, we have had a standard course of study. In fact, the first state superintendent wrote the textbook to be used in all of the public schools in North Carolina. So North Carolina is not new to the game of having statewide standards. When the State Board of Education adopted the standards along with other standards for other areas in 2010, there was widespread support from the General Assembly. Practically the same members are there now as they were there in 2010. We had support from our Teachers Association, from our principals, from our superintendents, and everyone said that they thought it was a good idea because they thought that working together with other states, we could have stronger standards and we could share information. So the debate has gone from total or almost total support to a place where social media have planted seeds that this is a takeover of public education in North Carolina of the federal government. So that's one argument that has been used. The other is that the standards will require us to collect data about our students, such as political and religious affiliations, that it will require us to collect retinal scans of our students. It is also said, some people argue that the standards are not rigorous. Others say that they're not developmentally appropriate. So social media in North Carolina, people who are part of social media have joined hands with people from other states to say that these standards are evil, that they will hurt our students. So that is the debate taking place in our state today.
I'm curious, you mentioned, of course, the federal involvement question. Would you say that's 99% of what's driving this in North Carolina, 50%, 25%? How much of this is about the federal role?
I would say that in the General Assembly would account for approximately 40% of the debate.
Okay.
But we have said, not loudly enough, I don't believe, or to enough people, that North Carolina adopted these standards of their own free will. Our State Board of Education, because we were in the process of revising our standards, overwhelmingly supported these standards. And I have said, I grew up in Virginia, and Virginia is a strong states' rights. If I felt, as state superintendent, that this was a takeover of the federal government, I would help in leading the parade.
Yeah.
But it is not the case in our state. People wanted these standards, and we don't see the standards as being perfect. I never have seen a perfect set of standards, but I do believe that using these standards in our state will move our achievement to a much better place than where we are today.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Terry, let's get you on this conversation. So when you look at the map and you look at which states are in the middle of the fiercest debates around Common Core, they tend to be in the South, and they tend to be some of the most conservative states. So here we have Kentucky, southern state, conservative state, and yet there seems to be very little of this same political backlash that we see elsewhere. So what's your secret? How is it that things seem so relatively calm in Kentucky? And by the way, I'll admit, as an advocate, I hope we don't jinx it by saying that.
Well, there's always an election coming up, so you never know
Right.
what may happen. What I would say is the General Assembly drove this agenda in Kentucky from the beginning. They passed Senate Bill 1 in 2009 unanimously. And that legislation required new standards, new assessments, new accountability systems, support for teachers. So we had the burning platform, so to speak, provided by our General Assembly. Now, our challenge was we didn't have any money to do this. And it hit right at the time the recession was reaching its height. So we looked to a very reasonable approach to get something for free. And from the very beginning, it was grassroots involvement, Michael. I think heavy involvement of teachers, heavy involvement of school leaders and college faculty who teach entering courses, and the business community and parent advocacy groups. So Kentucky's been known for a long time in leading education reform, and the collaborative efforts of all those groups together just made sense in Kentucky. Now, we did have a hearing last year on the standards, and it was interesting that most of the testimony against the standards came from outside of Kentucky, but all the testimony in support of the standards came from the Teachers Union, the Chamber of Commerce, all the associations are very supportive of the work because we've translated it into Kentucky's specific work, and we developed our own assessment. I think two things probably drove the agenda. Assessment consortia moving in with proposed national tests, and the teacher evaluation piece built on standards and assessments that teachers had not had time to really implement. So if I had to sum it up in one or two words, General Assembly support, strong involvement of teachers.
Right. Now, explain on the teacher evaluation piece in Kentucky. So this is clearly becoming a big issue in many states across the country, the conservative, liberal, all the states in between, that teachers are concerned about being held accountable on these new tests, for these new standards as the transition goes forward. Now, how is that going to work in Kentucky, and how is that what's the response been from the teacher groups?
Well, we've worked with teacher-led steering committee for 4 years to develop a professional growth system. Our system that we developed for evaluation was not a gotcha and a firing mechanism. It was a professional growth mechanism to give teachers good feedback and to put some key requirements on their observers to make sure principals knew what good instruction looked like. And student growth, it was an issue. Every teacher's okay with, I'd like to grow my kids from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, but the measure is not going to work if they don't understand it. Mm-hmm. So we had to develop a measure that teachers understood, and the vast majority of teachers don't have state tests they can be evaluated on. Mm-hmm. So you got to have measures that they use in their classroom for student growth to show that from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And then you got to have a reasonable judgment. I think too many states went too quickly on, well, it's got to be 50% test scores, and we're going to flunk teachers if they don't make it. I think that was the wrong approach, and it's bearing out today. So I think the evaluation, again, was collaboration, teacher-led.
Okay, good. We'll come back to some of those issues. Because, of course, there's the Common Core debate, but then there's all these related debates around it, and teacher evaluation is one of them. You mentioned the tests, of course, Kentucky going with its own test instead of the consortia, and it sounds like that has helped at least to avoid some of the debates that have come around the federal role. Lizette, in Texas, you did not adopt the Common Core, but you have gone through a process recently of adopting new standards, and you also went through a very heated legislative session a year ago, which rolled back some of Texas's reforms around testing and standards. Can you tell us a little bit about tell us that story and what are some of the lessons you take from it in Texas?
Much like Terry in Kentucky, I mean, the development of the Texas standards were organically Texas. Again, we started in 2006. Chairman Eisler's here somewhere in the audience, who helped author the bill that basically that already had the political will to develop standards around college and career readiness. So the way we started was we had vertical teams between public education and higher education that worked on college and career readiness standards in all 4 content areas, and it just focused on the college and career readiness standards. Dave Conley, who you all know, helped facilitate the process. And so once we had those standards developed and adopted by the Higher Education Coordinating Board, then the next process was to basically incorporate them into our Texas Essential Knowledge and Skills, which is our TEKS, which is our state standards. So what we did was we started with college career readiness standards, then we built them into our standards process. By then we'd already adopted math, so math was more of a not a real substantive, it was more of an integration of the college and career readiness standards, but the college and career readiness standards themselves came into the development in each of the standards in English language arts, social studies, and science. So building upon that, the legislature then, as we have a long history in developing criterion-based assessments, then asked us to develop assessments based upon these college and career readiness standards from 3 through 8, vertically aligned to college and career readiness, and then 15 end-of-course exams. And so we began implementation. We had money for professional development, for content development of those standards, for grants to districts to provide interventions where there may need to be more support in educating the school system about these college and career readiness standards. And then what the assessments would generally assess, not the test itself, because the test is designed differently. It is designed to be more of an assessment that helps kids think more critically about their exams and about how they actually are learning their course content. But in retrospect, where we made our mistakes, I guess I could say, is we went a little too fast. We went way too fast. This is what we really did. I think the high-stakes nature of the end-of-course exams, which brought into the debate about Algebra 2, which we'll be talking about later, chemistry, physics, requiring those courses to be passed by students, those assessments to be passed by students by their senior year, just created somewhat of a groundswell of pushback. And so right before the legislative session that Michael alluded to is the fact that legislators were getting calls. Moms were mad because no longer were they guaranteed that their kids were going to get into UT or A&M. The way that we had developed the calculation by which these kids had to pass these assessments for purposes of graduation or college admission was just too complicated. We weren't able to communicate the relevance of it. And so as a state that was so on the cutting edge of reform, we saw a real turn back in moving forward with these assessments. And so our debate, I guess, really isn't about the standards. That has the support of our education community. It's about the implementation, as everybody has mentioned before, and then the fact that we tied them so closely to these end-of-course exams. And one thing that I said yesterday that I do find scary today is that today, I think, that if our Texas legislature was meeting today, they would probably roll back all the tests if they could. We really have some work to do on education about why assessments are important and why the standards, why it's so important to make sure that we're assessing these standards for our kids going into their next career or post-secondary world.
So, and this is so key to understand that what the policy was in Texas was that the kids had to pass all these end-of-course exams to graduate. So that was, that was a, very big accountability on the student. The results of those tests were also going to be included in their grades, right? And of course, Texas has the top 10% policy where to get into UT Austin, basically, or many of the other, that you're guaranteed if you're in the top 10%. If you're not in the top 10% of your high school class, then you very well may not get in, even if you're in a relatively high-performing high school, et cetera. So suddenly, for all these moms, they're saying, wait a minute, my kid's GPA is going to depend on how they do in this high-stakes exam, and you see how this starts to get very controversial. And so another example of the debate being about not so much the standards or even the tests, but how those tests are used for accountability purposes, either for students or for teachers. June, in North Carolina, back to the teacher point, how is that playing out with teacher evaluations? What is the current policy in terms of how educators will be evaluated using the new standards, the new tests, and how have you managed that with the teacher organizations there?
About 5 years ago, we had an extensive review of our teacher evaluation system. We went through a very elaborate process where we engaged teachers, and it was a teachers' commission that really developed our teacher evaluation system. Yep. And as Terry mentioned, our system was developed to be one of continuous improvement. It was not to be one that would determine hiring or firing, et cetera, and that's still in place in North Carolina. And one of the standards, we have 6 standards for teachers, and one of the standards deals with student growth. So teachers have growth as one of the factors in determining where they need to improve or how they're doing, and that is to be used to improve instruction in the classroom. Unfortunately, because of what happens in other states, and we don't have a border around North Carolina yet, information from other states get to North Carolina. So we have worked very diligently with our teachers, and there's a lot of work to do because we've had a high teacher turnover rate in the last 3 to 4 years to help people understand. Our teacher association supports our teacher evaluation system. They have said publicly that they see this as something that is good for teachers, good for improving instruction. So one of our challenges is to make sure that it does not move from its initial intent of being used for continuous improvement to something that would be a gotcha for teachers.
Gotcha. Now, many states have been passing these moratoriums saying for a year or two, we're not going to use the test scores on these new tests. We're either just not going to calculate growth scores, or they won't count in any way, or there won't be consequences attached. Have you moved in that direction?
When we moved to the new standards, we also revised all of our end-of-grade and end-of-course tests to align with the new standards. So last year was the first year that we had administered the new test aligned to the new standards in English language arts and mathematics. So for 1 year, we reported the scores, but it did not count toward how a school is labeled. Our General Assembly did pass a law saying that this past school year, 14-15, that all of our schools would receive A's, B's, C's, D's, and F's. So this will be the first year that the new test will count for school evaluation.
Okay.
In our state, we just have 3 end-of-course tests at the high school level that count for students, and that end-of-course grade is 20% of the students' grade for the year.
Okay. All right, let's get into some of the implementation issues, particularly around curriculum, professional development. We've probably all seen the New York Times article from, I think it was just yesterday, about math, about, just this sense that there's just been a lot of confusion out there in the field. Parents of young children, I've got a kindergartner, feel confused about what they're seeing, what's coming home, some of the worksheets. That seems like the math is so much more complicated or convoluted or confusing than it used to be, or maybe than it needs to be. Some people would say, look, there's basically no state role in this. That curriculum is something that's done at the local level. The local districts select their textbooks. In your states, we'll start with you, Terry, has the state taken any responsibility for trying to help school districts select textbooks or otherwise get access to curriculum that is high quality, that's aligned to the standards, that's not so confusing, but that's really well designed? How do you think through those issues?
We're a local control state, so the state cannot dictate curriculum. However, we brought teams from every school district together for 3 years, once a month, to help them understand the expectations of the standards and to help them have developed criteria to review materials and resources. We were so early in the process that there wasn't a lot out there. Most of our teachers had to develop their own stuff, so we provided them a software system, statewide software system that they could access. That's slowly growing. You don't get that overnight, and teachers are adding resources to that software system for assessment, curriculum, instructional, and all kinds of things that teachers, listening to other teachers, will utilize. Textbooks, we didn't have any money for textbooks for 5 years, so it really didn't make any difference. Local districts were having to figure that out, and it was probably a good time not to have money for textbooks because textbooks were not where they needed to be, and they still are not today. There is no one math textbook for 3 through 8 Common Core. There are a lot of repackaged textbooks that say, hey, this is Common Core. They just changed the label, but it's going to take, the publishing industry using clear guidelines that the Council of Chief State School Officers achieve and others have put forward. It's going to take a little while before we get the materials. But here's the beauty now, is there's such a common set of expectations, and they're very similar to what Texas and Virginia have, that textbook publishing might get a little bit more effective and efficient and maybe lower cost a little bit because we're all kind of starting with the same foundation. That was one of the early reasons why we went with Common Core.
Mm-hmm. All right, interesting. So you are hopeful that it's about to get better, that we're going to start seeing better textbooks, better materials coming, and that some of these early problems around the confusing math lessons and things will eventually go away? I mean, is that...
Yeah, but we didn't wait We're not waiting. Teachers are developing, and we're sharing.
Yeah, so you're doing teacher-developed things. Lizette, what about for Texas? I mean, you've long been a textbook adoption state. That's been a controversial process in Texas. But, I mean, do you see that as being a helpful state role in making sure that the materials meet some bar around quality?
Absolutely not. That is up to the local school districts to determine. But I think that part of the implementation piece is that where our system was before with the tax, before it became the STAR, is it was very easy to be able to teach to the test. So you pulled a test off of the internet, and it basically tested the same kinds of concepts. What frustrated, I think, the education community with the STAR exam is it wasn't so cut and dry. This test actually, even though now we've released tests, what people are finding is you can't really teach to it. You really have to teach the standards behind it in order for your kids to be successful. And I think that's a whole new way of thinking that is really starting to penetrate the education community in Texas, and probably as the PARC and the Smarter Balance get out there. But it is this whole notion that, you know, when we criticize standardized testing for all over the years, it's been, well, you're just teaching to the test. You have these tax worksheets is what we call it. They're probably Common Core worksheets. I don't know. And it's a kind of a drill and kill. You can't do that anymore. And so it's really taking a different way of teaching and developing instructional strategies to really address the standards that are truly going to be aligned to college and career readiness, even though we don't have any state assessments to really determine college and career readiness anymore. But we do still have AP, you know, IB and all those. So,
But help us understand. Go back to the textbook issue. I mean, Texas is still doing textbook adoption, right? And so that is, I mean, is that something that states that don't have state, you know, a textbook adoption at the state level, is that something they might consider doing?
It's decentralized, right? So the board does bless certain instructional materials, but we also have open source materials. So there was a bill that was passed during the last legislative session that decentralized textbook adoption, basically give districts instructional materials allotments, and they get to decide what they want to buy. Okay. They can buy off list if they want using the instructional allotment, or they can buy other stuff. Okay. They can diversify. They can look at opportunities like Khan Academy or other tools that are out there in the netherworld to really kind of develop their kids in the classroom level. But again, it's a different way of thinking, and I think for all of us, we're really having to try to see what the digital landscape is bringing to all our classrooms and really see how we can take advantage of that to really give our kids the tools they need so that they can be successful.
But now, I imagine you've got some tiny school districts in Texas where the superintendent drives the bus and, you know, you hear the...
Sure.
I mean, how do they have the capacity to vet the materials, make these judgments? I mean, do they need more support from the state in order to, at the end of the day, make good decisions, especially when we know there's a lot of publishers out there selling bad stuff?
Right. Well, and again, that's the role of our regional education service centers. They really build capacity for the agency. As I had mentioned, which I kind of forgot to talk about in my opening monologue or whatever it was, is that we did experience in between this rigorous trajectory of our assessments and standards a budget shortfall. And so during that budget shortfall, we were cut by a third. So the agency itself has really been trying to build back that opportunity to be a resource to our school districts. But in the meantime, our regional education service centers have helped build capacity for us out in the field to provide those kinds of services, particularly in the more rural areas and the areas where they have less accessibility or less dollars, to really just kind of build their own from the ground up.
Mm-hmm. June, how's this working out in North Carolina? How do you think about these issues around curriculum, textbooks?
When the General Assembly passed the law that we would participate in the Common Core, they also passed another law that we would extend our school days for our students from 180 days to 185 days. Mm-hmm. However, they also gave a waiver that allowed the State Board of Education and the department to waive those extra 5 days if those days were to be used to improve student achievement. So practically every school district in our state except one presented a waiver that they would use those days, those 5 days, for professional development of teachers to implement the new standards across all of the areas. So for 2 years running, our teachers had 5 days each year for professional development and the development of materials to use in the classroom to teach the new standards. Concurrent to that initiative, we did something very similar to what Terry described in Kentucky. We had summer institutes, we had workshops. In fact, we have had over 100 workshops for the past since 2010 to help our teachers make good decisions about materials to use and to help them collaborate together to develop those materials. So we've also developed online professional development modules for our teachers. And at last count, we have 96,000 teachers in our state, and we have had completed 477 modules dealing with the implementation of the new standards. So we've used 2 approaches. One, to have local school districts develop their materials to implement the new standards, including all areas. And we have, as a department, developed materials that could be used as a guide. Our stance is the department, the State Board of Education, develop the standards, and it is a decision of that teacher in the classroom, that local school district, as to what curriculum materials are to be used. Now, as I speak, we have 450 teachers in our state gathered together in Raleigh, and that is the first second day of our teachers. We chose from a pool of 1,500 to further the development of lesson plans and materials that can be used in the classroom to implement standards. And all of that work will be housed in our statewide technology platform called Homebase, which is an integrated student information system, an assessment system, a learning system with
no retinal scans in there.
No
right?
retinal scans.
Right.
We didn't have enough money to go that
yeah,
far.
okay, good. Maybe
Just kidding. We're
Don't
not
tweet that,
interested in retinal scans.
Yes.
But all of that work is to give the teacher in the classroom the tools where they can choose to help personalize learning for every single child in our state, so that ultimately all our students will be ready for options once they leave.
What I feel like I'm hearing is a lot of focus on the teacher-developed materials. I mean, really, a big move away, perhaps, from the model of the textbook being such a central instructional guide. Is that the hope there?
And like Terry, we didn't have any money for textbooks purchases, so we had to scurry to help the teachers in the classroom, and that was one advantage of the different states adopting the standards. We could use that which had been developed in another state with our teachers.
Okay.
Also.
Let's keep you in the hot seat just for a little bit longer, June. Talk some about the tests. So next spring, finally, Park and Smarter Balance, the first time that they will be used as the summative assessments for states. As of today, I believe North Carolina is still planning to use Smarter Balance. Does that?
In December 2013, the State Board of Education passed a policy that we would study which tests that we would use beginning the year 16-17. And in the meantime, unless the General Assembly does something differently than what I'm about ready to say, we will continue with the tests that we have developed through the input of teachers to assess how our students are doing in reading and mathematics in grades 3 through 8, and then for 3 courses at the high school level.
So, it's interesting. So here we are, we have this panel, and so none of these states are going to be using Park or Smarter Balance next year. And we're down to, I think Ed Week reported, less than 50% of the students in the country will be taking one of those tests next year. I'd just be curious from your perspectives. I mean, what do you see? Some people are nervous. Does this mean trouble for Park and Smarter Balanced? Are they going to survive? How do you come down? Terry, what do you see? Can you imagine Kentucky choosing at some point to use Park or Smarter Balanced? And do you think these consortia are going to be around a few years from now?
Sure, a state's decision about their assessment, I was very outspoken about this 4 years ago. It'll come down to a request for proposals, and it'll come down to a procurement process based on, does the assessment meet the requirements of the state? Does it measure the standards of the state? What is the cost of the assessment? And if it's a technology-based platform, do you have the bandwidth to do this? So as we've seen it play out, that's exactly what will probably happen. That's what will be happening in North Carolina. What's the best test? You'll have a process to review it. It happened in Michigan, happened recently in a few other states that are changing. So the procurement process, now the procurement process could end up, I like both tests. Both assessment consortia have done great work. I really like the SBAC approach with the accommodations. I like the park assessments. I like them both so much that I want their assessment items that were developed with public dollars, $330+ million of public tax money was provided to two assessment consortia to develop assessment items tied to the standards. Now, the process for giving those grants said these items should be freely accessible to states as long as we ensure that we adhere to the security things. So what the beauty here, the long-term survival, I think, is test item development, because every state has to keep in their procurement process the development of new test items, because you release a certain amount to the public every year. Mm-hmm. You got a certain number of items that don't work anymore, and you got to release some items to teachers so they can see what it looks like you're being assessed. So, I serve on the National Assessment Governing Board. Test item development is just such a continuing process. So I think the long-term survivability of these two consortia and at a great savings to states would be consortiums around test item development. We are begging for that for science right now. We adopted Next Gen Science. But the test assessment items are going to be very different than traditional science assessments, and it's going to be very expensive to develop them, and Kentucky won't be able to afford that on our own. Mm-hmm. We need partners. So I do think the consortia have a role to play in the future.
That's interesting. So it may be that we say, well, only half the states are using Parker Smarter Balanced, but it could be that many more states, in fact, are using Parker Smarter Balanced assessment items under the hood. That's very interesting. Let me ask you one more test question, Terry. A lot of folks are nervous about what's going to happen next spring with these new tests, likely very high cut scores, likely very high failure rates in terms of students being college and career ready or on track. You've gone through this already in Kentucky. You've already introduced these tougher tests, and you saw your proficiency rates drop already. So how did you manage that with parents, with the public? How did you help explain this to folks about what was going on? And what lessons can you share with other people who are about to go through this?
With the standards adoption, we had a pretty aggressive communication model, but with the assessment, we doubled up on it. That's when it really matters to mom and dad, when the kid brings home the test report at the end of the year and they say, my goodness, my child has been distinguished for 4 years and now all of a sudden they're novice or apprentice. And that's our model. So Pritchard Committee, which is a parent advocacy group for education in Kentucky, went all over Kentucky meeting with PTAs, parent groups. The PTA was heavily involved. We gave talking points to administrators, teachers, superintendents, everybody. We kept our General Assembly aware of what was going to happen in the prediction. But it's face validity. If a child takes an ACT test, which everybody does as a junior in Kentucky, and they don't meet the benchmarks, that's a little late to be telling the kids. So we tell them as early as third grade whether they're on track to meet the ACT benchmarks, because mom and dad get that. ACT means something. It's admissions into programs. It's remediation. And if my child is ready along the way, we're going to pretty safely predict that they will be meeting our college-ready and career-ready standards. So communication, communication, communication.
Okay, excellent. I want to get the audience in here in just a moment, so start thinking about some questions that you may have, and hopefully there's a microphone that we can send around. Yep, there is one. Let me ask you one more question. We're here in Washington, D.C. We mentioned at the beginning that the debate in many states is about the federal role. So if you could tell Arne Duncan what he should or shouldn't say, or should or shouldn't do around the Common Core going forward, what message would you share with our Secretary of Education? And either of you like to take that?
Why don't you tell him?
Try to avoid profanity
obviously,
if you can.
I think, okay, you want to know what happened with Texas? I mean, I think, number one, we were never recognized for the fact that we were the first state out of the gate to adopt a college and career readiness policy agenda, and that we had gone into the development of college and career readiness standards, but they were immediately dismissed by the administration, and they've been a lot better to work with lately. But back then, it was, you know, you either sign this MOU or don't even think about applying for Race to the Top, even though we knew that we met a lot of the facets and a lot of the opportunities that were trying to be built into the Race for the Top program. So right from there, we got off on a bad start. And I think that has now translated with a lot of the other states in the fact that they did say, well, yes, you know, because unlike you, Terry, and we heard about this yesterday, there were a lot of states that went into the process without the community forums, without engaging their educator system, without educating the public. For the most part, they just signed the MOU and they technically adopted the college and career readiness standards. Now, a lot of them are going through new processes like you have, a lot of what you did in North Carolina after the fact, to really build the stakeholder community around the Common Core. And maybe I'm using you as a wrong example, but that's what I heard from other folks yesterday. And so I think for that really hurt a lot of folks, because it is this notion of indoctrination and takeover of the federal government. And while that's far and few between, Race to the Top is long gone, it's still, every time there's a grant opportunity that comes out of the federal government, the first thing I get asked is this going to require us to adopt Common Core?
North Carolina, when we adopted the standards, did have extensive input before the fact, because we were on the road to revise, and so each school district was asked to have its own committee and to provide us feedback. So when we applied for Race to the Top, I did not feel any pressure from anyone that we adopt the Common Core standards in order to get Race to the Top dollars. We saw the Race to the Top dollars as a way of our furthering the agenda that our State Board of Education had already adopted, to have college and career standards, to have highly effective teachers and principals in our states, to develop a database, a data system that would provide information so that we could improve instruction. So we felt no pressure, and we were fortunate, and I'm still happy that we got $400 million, because if we had not gotten that $400 million, we would not have had any money to help our teachers with professional development. Our local school districts have spent approximately $44 million in professional development for teachers for all of our standards, not just the one in the Common Core. We've spent $22 million at the state level. The General Assembly zeroed out all professional development during that time between 2010 and today. So I guess if I were to advise our Secretary Duncan, I would say, please emphasize the importance of each state having the responsibility for educating children, and we as the U.S. Department of Education are there to support you in your initiatives to do that which is in the best interest of your students.
They
Okay.
could have started that, making Texas an example
Right.
of pursuing that agenda.
Yeah. Terry.
Only thing I would add, I'm a big fan of the Secretary. I think the Secretary, if 20 years from now, when they write the books about this period, you will see this was probably one of the most intensive times for ed reform in history, and more dollars went into ed reform. I think the advice, and I've given him this several times, is there's a level of big picture and there's a level of detail, and sometimes his staff gets a little bit too much in the detail that states really ought to control, and that is a constant battle with the state superintendent too, is how much do I really push, because I got so many kids out there that aren't being given a good education. And the Secretary's passion for children is always obvious. One last thing I'd add that's not related to your question but might interest the audience. We got a lot of critics of Common Core in Kentucky, too. We call it the Kentucky Core Academic Standards. What we're going to do is some of these critics may have valid concerns. We should honor their concerns. And so what we're doing, we're launching with Back to School what we call the Kentucky Core Academic Standards Challenge, and we will create a database for any citizen in Kentucky, teachers, principals, parents, students, anybody, to read the standards. All right. And then an open dialogue box to say, I would like to see you change this standard because I'm concerned that it's not developmentally appropriate, or it's too rigorous, or it's not rigorous enough. I would like to see you add this standard because it's missing in the preparation of kids for college. What we'll do, leave that open for about 8 months. We will print a very lengthy report, I'm sure, by standard, and give it to our higher ed and business and K-12 community to review, and then we'll have a panel come together to make it into, here are the recommended changes to the standards based on Kentucky citizens. We did something like that up front on a national level. Now we'll be in our 5th year this year of implementation. So we will go through the review process, and by the 6th year, we will have revisions to the standards based on input from Kentucky citizens.
Interesting. And of course, the other states have done this already. I mean, we've seen in Florida, for example, that they have added quite a few standards to the Common Core. And from the very beginning, there was the expectation that states could add to the Common Core to make them their own.
Our State Board of Education has a review cycle also, and we will be doing something very similar to what Terry has just identified. We want to use media to help get that feedback. Yeah. And we will also have vertical and horizontal teams of teachers who have used the standards for at least 3 years to get their feedback. I think that we can strengthen the standards through that process.
Interesting. By the way, you all are very good at being polite and ducking my question around Arnie Duncan, but that's okay. I am curious, and we see, for example, right now, big debate in Louisiana. Your fellow state chief, John White, in now a very public battle with the governor over whether to stay the course with Common Core, and Arnie Duncan has weighed in on that debate. And I guess the question that I would have is that actually helpful to the folks supporting the standards, or does that just add to this narrative that the feds are driving this thing? I'll leave that question out there as a rhetorical question. All right, who's got questions out there? And where's our microphone? There's the microphone. And yes, Giselle, tell us who you are and ask your question briefly.
Giselle Huff, Jackman Hume Foundation in San Francisco. So you're speaking about assessments of learning. Summative tests are an autopsy. It's what happens at the end of the year. If you're thinking about what the Common Core is supposed to inspire, it is assessment for learning, which is formative and happens all day long, every day, as Sal Khan described. Are you seeing any movement in that direction?
Yeah, sure.
I believe that education is in a transition from the assessment of learning to assessment for learning. And one of the reasons why I was so excited about the work of the Smarter Balance Consortium is that I saw the items as a way of our moving toward assessment for learning, as you have said, rather than having so much emphasis at the end of the year. And I believe that when we look back, we will, as to what is happening today with testing across the United States, we will see that we are in that period of transition. And my personal belief is that we need to move to a system where we have greater emphasis on assessment along the way, where we can have a growth chart for students rather than having all of our emphasis at what happens at the end of the year. I also believe, as a part of that transition, that we may move to the place where we no longer have grades such as A, B, C, D, F, but we will personalize education. And I think that we have the opportunity to move to a better dynamic, to a better place of personalization through the use of technology and assessment for learning.
You know, this came up yesterday at a breakout session on assessments, and particularly the idea of using these more frequent assessments that many school districts use, the formative assessments or benchmark exams, and somehow roll up the information into a judgment about performance. And, you know, Park and Smarter Balance had considered that sort of thing. The trade-off is it starts to feel like a state-mandated curriculum, you know, because if you're really going to check in, if you're going to have a test every 6 weeks and then everybody in the state's going to take it, you know, it starts to feel to a lot of people that that's an infringement on local control. So that's some of the trade-offs that people may need to work through.
And part of it is how the school districts use it. I mean, there are going to be some school districts that are going to be able to use those benchmarks to actually improve and define instruction for those kids. But what we were seeing when we had a bill that said, get rid of more benchmarking, we've got too many tests, is that what central office was using was to actually go into the classroom and dictate to that classroom, to that teacher, how to teach. And not really focusing on the kid as much as they were focusing on, teacher, you're not doing the job you need to do, that's going to affect this campus, which is going to affect my district, and then it just kind of rolled up. So it's a very hard nut to crack, I think, and I think that's part of what we're thinking about in Texas is how we really build an accountability system to acknowledge those local assessments, but without a top-down definition of what those assessments need to be, other than that the outcomes are that kids are learning.
Let's go to the back.
Senator Howard Stevenson from Utah. I want to follow on to Giselle's comment, and also Sal Khan. Do we see the time when end-of-level tests will be done away with because formative assessments have actually revealed the mastery that is wanted to achieve, so that on that grid that Sal showed on those components of math concepts, we know that each child has already received it. So we're no longer going to have the end-of-level test anymore because they already proved their mastery in the formative assessments. Is there a way of ever achieving that so that formative actually proves that you have the mastery?
Terry, what do you think?
Kentucky's no stranger to this issue. The Kentucky Education Reform Act tried to move in this direction back in 1990. All through the 90s, formative assessments, portfolios, those types of things were being developed. What derailed the effort? Two things: validity and reliability of the assessments. And anytime you put those assessments, the formative, into an accountability model, you begin to get people who game the system. So fast forward, we're now going back to the future with this issue, because we are now working closely with Linda Darling-Hammond, Center for Innovation at Kentucky, Gene Wilhoit, the Chiefs organization has an Innovation Lab Network, and Park and Smart Balance are doing this work to recognize that the formative model could be the best model. And if you look at Finland, well, there you go. Less summative tests, use the money you save to really develop the validity and reliability of the formative. But there's so many hurdles that we have to jump over, and it is such a political issue that it's going to have to tread softly to get there.
Great. Dave Driscoll.
Thank you. David Driscoll, former commissioner of Massachusetts. It strikes me we're at ECS, which is unique for having not only the governors and the chief state school officers, but also legislators. And it strikes me no matter what the state, blue, red, whatever, legislators are becoming very active in the minutia. Terry, you talked about the broad and the detailed. Is this a trend you think that's short-lived, or is this something we're going to live with? I mean, you dealt with it in Texas and North Carolina. I mean, they're getting into real details here, and it's troubling.
I think what I've seen in some states are the General Assembly was left out of the process. And I think that's been the secret in Kentucky, that the General Assembly dictated the process and gave the vision for the process. I think other states, maybe the governor and the chief signed and agreed to Common Core and maybe didn't bring the General Assembly along. So I think it's just a reaction to their constituents who call and say, hey, these tests aren't working. Hey, we don't want Arnie Duncan running education in Louisiana, blah, blah, blah. So I think it's just a natural reaction. Now, I hope it's not long-term. I hope we figure it out, because I don't think too many General Assembly members want to sit in a couple of 100 hours of meetings deciding which standard goes in which place. So I don't think they want that, but I think they want that in some places right now.
Mm-hmm. In North Carolina, our General Assembly, the same General Assembly for the most part, who is now studying the Common Core, were the same General Assembly members who passed unanimously that we should participate in the Common Core standards movement. I believe that, and I can just speak for North Carolina, but I believe that our General Assembly will become more and more active in getting into the details. Whereas traditionally, except in social studies and healthful living, our General Assembly has left, for the most part, the responsibility to our State Board of Education. One of the reasons why I say that is that social media and the networks are so powerful, where parents and others who can communicate directly with legislators. It's much easier to send that email, that text message, than it is to write a letter. And so I think that we will continue to see more and more activity with parents, and we do need more and more activity with parents. But I think that as educators and people who want to make sure that parents are involved, will have a greater responsibility of involving parents as we go through the processes of revision, et cetera, so that that can be minimized in a state.
Something to watch this summer, in Oklahoma, an interesting debate unfolding. The legislature there gave itself the authority to review the new standards that the state board is supposed to come up with and revise them, possibly. And now some members of the state board and others have filed a lawsuit with the state Supreme Court saying that that is unconstitutional under the Oklahoma Constitution, that the state boards are the ones who are supposed to set standards. So this issue is very real and is now happening around the country. All right, that brings us to the end of our time. Please join me in thanking our panelists for their great comments. As the handout from ECS shows, for all of you, everything you've heard in the press, we still have 40-plus states moving forward with the Common Core. So this is not a debate that is going to go away anytime soon. I'm sure when we gather again next year, we'll be still talking about many of these issues. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much for sharing what's going on in your state. ECS is just beginning to do more and more work on Common Core, so please keep an eye out for some of our forthcoming resources. And let's thank the panel again for their expertise, and we'll move to the next speakers. Thank you all.